listening to the Archive Room podcast. Faster Mai, I'm Judith Lay, and I'm very pleased to find you waiting for me at the door to the Archive Room, the place where we keep stories of island life in years gone by, told by the people who were there. So come on in, sit down and make yourself comfortable, and let's listen to this week's selection. We began this series in September with some great stories of harvesting, mill days and autumn life on island farms. And now, as we've arrived at the last programme in the present series, I thought we'd explore the origins of a centuries-old tradition that has died out now in all but name, but was once of huge importance in the farming year. It's Hollantide Day, November the 12th, and this familiar music tells us that it's going to be John Kennaugh who tells this story.
Hello and welcome to this week's farming programme. This is a significant time of the year in the agricultural calendar, Hollantide Day, the date when tenancies changed on Manx farms, before which there would have been a number of farm sales. But to retrace how Hollantide Day has been celebrated in years gone by, when it really was very important, we talked to Harvey Briggs, who remembers a lot of things that happened round about Hollantide. Here's Harvey.
Well, I think it was a time of high adventure for a lot of people because they felt that it was the start of something new in their lives. On the other hand, it was probably a time of sadness for many too, because it was a relic of the old feudal system in farming. We had the landlord, the tenant and the worker. Everybody knew their place. It was a sort of a trinity, and people in one of those categories rarely moved up. Sometimes moved down, but rarely moved up. I don't think it was a very good system, really. It went on, of course, for many years, in as much as that, I suppose, in our lifetime, certainly in my lifetime, 85% of the men who farmed the land were tenants, and they depended on the landlord to give them the farm, to let them have the farm. And until we had tenant security in the Isle of Man in 1968 and 69, 30 or 40 years behind Britain, until we had that, there's no doubt about it that there was this system of hierarchy all the way through. The landlord seemed to inflict his power on the tenant, and the tenant inflicted his power on the workers.
And why was November the 12th so significant then? Was that just a convenient time of the year for the farming year to end?
And that's the exact question that David Collister put to Dr Fenella Bazin when they discussed Hollantide.
Well, it was really the first day of the Celtic New Year, and it all dated back to where the calendar changed. So instead of being the 1st of November, it became the 12th of November, and the 11th was the eve, of course. But November, by the way, the Manx name for it, means the first month of the winter. And, of course, it's also the first month of the year. And it was the day when they killed the beef and the meat for the winter so they could stock it away, because they wouldn't want to feed the animals during the winter because of the fodder. And it was also the day for letting land and for taking over farms, which, of course, is a tradition we still have today. A lot of contracts change hands on the 12th of November.
Yes.
And it was the hiring fairs as well. Again, because it was the start of the new year. And the farm workers, the men and the women, would go to the hiring fairs and would try and get themselves jobs for the year. They were very often just employed on the 12-month basis. And Mona Douglas went to pick up information at one of these fairs when she was quite a girl, I gather, when she'd be in her 20s or 30s maybe. And she nearly got hired. And it was a story she loved telling.
Let's go back now to Harvey Briggs in conversation with John Kennaugh and see what else Harvey adds about the timing of Hollantide.
Mostly by then the potatoes were up, the crops, that was the last crop to come out of the ground. Everything was out of the ground except the green crop, the turnips. And if a man took a tenancy of a farm on November the 12th, he was generally allowed till, I think it was February the 12th, to get them off. But apart from that, the land was fairly bare. The livestock, the cattle and horses were all indoors for the winter time. They generally went in at the end of October, beginning of November, so it was a convenient time for that. It was a slack time on the farm, and a time when farmers could move from one farm to another if they had to, and when the men too could move from one farm to another too.
Now, you said a bit about the system of tenancy. So was there great movement then from farm to farm at Hollantide?
Oh, yes. Don't forget that in those days we'd have 1,200 individual farmers. And of course, it was the time mainly as not only for farmers changing farms, but for the men and the maids. Don't forget there were lots of maids living in the farmhouses. This house goes back 450 years. And I'm determined, as long as I live, to keep it as it's been for many generations of farmers. I mean, we've had generations and generations of farmers here.
And the point you're making, Harvey, that there would have been men servants and maid servants here at Ballycommerton?
Oh yes, the men could come into the room outside here without coming through the house. You can still see out the yard here if we go out. I can still show you where the old steps went up to the men's room, and there was no access from that room into the house. A man, if he was that way inclined, went to the pub, he could come home without disturbing anybody, or the men we had didn't seem to be that way inclined, and they often came in for supper before they went up there. But about 10 o'clock the back door was locked, so if they came after 10 o'clock, well, they'd had their supper.
How would they come to be in a particular job then on a particular farm? How were they engaged?
Well, it wasn't a system that I liked very much, because I know my uncle was a tenant farmer all this time, and it was only in the last year of his life that he was able to buy this farm. He was inclined to, I suppose, everybody did it, inclined to inflict on the workers the same sort of discipline that the landlord put onto him. And I remember that, of course, the first hiring fair of the year was Michaelmas, the second Wednesday in October, held from time immemorial, I think, at Michael. Often farm men would go there and hire, and then they would be fixed up. They knew where they were at the second Wednesday in October. They knew then that they had a job when November the 12th came. But not every man, certainly only about half them would hire at Michaelmas. And my uncle, his men, and particularly the man who was with us for many years, the late Albert Sale, a great friend of the family in later years, he was with us 12 years. But my Uncle Jim McCubbin, he never ever said to him before Hollantide morning, that's November the 12th, he never said to him, "Are you staying on?" He'd leave it, and Albert would never go to look for another job because he was quite happy, but he never knew when he got up on November the 12th where he was going to sleep that night. And he wasn't the only one. Right. There were many like it. That was the old system amongst farmers, and consequently it wasn't a very good system, and even then the wages they got were pretty poor really, but on the other hand the single men had a home, they had somewhere to sleep, and they had good food. Most farms provided good food. You talk about the pay, I've got a record here of one man we had on November the 12th, 1939. I recorded in my diary that Billy Kelly of Clove and Stone's Cottage, Baldrine, he was hired at 16 shillings per week, that's 80 pence per week, with full board and insurance. And he was quite happy. But you see, he was more or less an orphan, in as much that his mother had married again. He wasn't wanted at home. He had to have a home. So as a single man, farming suited him. We weren't by any means his only employers, because he travelled around several farms. In fact, the poor fellow, he was stone deaf, and he was killed on the road at London some years ago. But he was one of the typical farm workers who went from farm to farm. I think he stayed with us 2 years, and then he decided he was moving on and that sort of thing.
Well, I remember Billy Kelly, because I remember when I was working in Ballymenic with right. Kelly's, and we'd always meet him on mill days. Billy Kelly would often be a man set to feed the mill, and I'd be maybe cutting on the board, and Billy would be feeding. Yes, I did know Billy Kelly.
Connor, he was known as Connor.
That's right.
You know, he told me once how he got the name Connor. When he was a boy, he was always pretending to be a steam engine, and he was going chuk 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 chuk. And when a steam engine goes downhill, it goes Connor, because it's getting held back on the piston. So from then on, they called him Connor.
But the countryside was full of characters in those days, wasn't
Yes.
it? I mean, and it was probably that system that you've just described probably bred these sort of characters, didn't it?
Yes.
Men who went about the countryside from farm to farm like that. There was a lot of them about. But it's interesting that you mentioned men being asked to stay on Hollantide morning. I must have been right on the tail end of this system, because I can well remember working with Tom Kissick in Bolacross, and he would always say to me on Hollantide morning, I take it you're staying on for another year.
Yes.
And that was still the tail end of that system.
You weren't a hired man, were you?
Yes.
You were a hired man? Oh, well, you know what.
Oh, yes, I was. And yes, that was quite an experience, that, looking back on it now.
Yes.
Farmers moved on and new farmers came in. It was a great shifting time, wasn't it?
Oh, yes. We moved here in 1938, Hollantide 1938, from Ballabeg, from the farm which is now the site of the abattoir and the creamery, and we moved to Ballaculamartin here that year. And the thing I always remember about it was that we drove all the cattle, sheep and unbroken colts along Johnny Watson's Lane, along the Balnard Road, to Parkfield Corner. No traffic lights then, of course, but straight out over Glencrutchery Road, through Onken and up here. No problem at all. There were 4 lads, all on bicycles. I was in charge of them. I was just like John Wayne, moving a herd of cattle, and I was coming behind on the bike, shouting out orders. And we had one lad going on ahead, and his job was to shut garden gates. Every house had a garden with a wall round it, or a fence and a garden gate. None of the open plan estates, so it was no problem. And then we had 2 others riding herd on the side on bicycles. We no problem bringing them through.
You mentioned Hollantide Fair. Where was the Hollantide Fair held, Harvey? Do you remember the Hollantide Fair being held?
Yes, I remember it. It went on for a good many years after the war. I think it was during the 1950s it probably stopped. It was held latterly in a yard at the Adelphi Hotel. The Adelphi Hotel was down by the old police station just below Athol Street, and it was held there on November the 12th. I don't know much about the Michael one because that was outside my territory, but the men used to go into the hiring fair, and on November the 12th, hopefully by midday they would have got fixed up. But one of the most pathetic sights I ever saw, I was going down the hill, in the White Bridge Hill from here, walking into Onken on the evening of Hollantide Fair Day, November the 12th, and I met an old farm worker I knew coming up the hill, and he had all his worldly goods in a brown paper parcel, because in those days he hadn't a case or anything like that, but he had his best suit on. Generally a blue serge suit we wore in those days, blue serge suit. And he was carrying with him his hobnail boots, pair of working trousers, overalls maybe, and clean shirt or 2, and maybe a change of underclothes. And he had all those, and he was coming up the hill, and he said to me, I haven't got fixed up. He said, I'm not fixed up. And he said, do you think your boss would let me sleep on the loft tonight? I've got nowhere to go. Because he was one of these men who was dependent on having a regular job and a farm to go in. Well, he was getting to the evening of his life. I suppose in his 60s. He was slow, not the very best of men, but given a lifetime to various farmers. And I said, oh yes, I'm sure he will. Go up and knock on the back door and he'll let you in. So he stayed with us here for about 6 weeks, and he got his food and he potted round, and in the end he did get a job, but he went on. But that was the sort of position that so many people were in. And even the married farm workers weren't a big lot better off. They were generally fixed up before Hollantide because they had to have a house. But then, you see, they had to take a job where there was a house. Not every farm had a house, so often enough it was a case of taking a job because there was a home for themselves, and often big families in those days, and that's the way they had to always take a job, even if it wasn't the best one that was available. I remember meeting a chap in Douglas he went on to drive a baker's cart for most of his life. And he used to come up here delivering bread, and he said, farming, he said, I loved it. He said, I did 1 year out in St. John's, John, out not far from you. He said, I did 1 year of it, he said, out there, he said, and I loved every minute except for one thing. What was that? Spuds and herring, breakfast, dinner and tea. I stuck me year, he said, because I'd taken me shilling. I stuck the year, but at the end of that time, I moved back into Douglas, and I never worked on a farm since.
Now, when a farmer came to the end of his farming career and he was retiring, he would have a farm sale. And we've had 1 or 2 farm sales this year, but nothing like the crop of sales that there used to be. Even in my younger days, we would see maybe 12, 14, 16 sales at Hollantide. What memories do you have of notable farm sales, perhaps, that maybe you remember or that you attended, or the characters that attended those sales?
Well, of course, nowadays we drive there in our cars. You just go there and park, and then when you've finished your business, you can go off home, and it's so easy. But I remember from here, just in the years after the war, when petrol was still scarce and there weren't many vehicles of any sort, I remember going to a farm sale at the Barony at Mackald and walking to a halfway house to get the electric tram, taking the electric tram to Bellajora and walking out to the farm sale from there. Of course, it was a day out for us then. The day was our own. We'd taken it off as a day off. Well, I wasn't buying anything, but I wanted to see the place and see the farm and see the life of the day. You could come home when you were ready. You didn't have any work to do. But nowadays it's also changed that if you do go to a farm sale, you're there for a couple of hours, 3 hours, and then you've got to come home to do the fixing up and the work at night. So times have changed a lot in that respect.
But you do describe it so aptly, Harvey. That's exactly what it was. It was a day out, wasn't it? It was a social event. Yeah. You went to see the farm, to meet the people who were there, and to discuss the farming topics that related to everybody there. And that was the great thing about it.
Yeah, and we used to get a cup of smoked coffee. They had boilers, you see. There's old Jimmy from Crystals, and he used to go down collecting wood to stoke up the fire. And he got this fire going in a big pot or something on it, and he made this coffee, and it was terrible stuff. But you were a long way from home, and nowadays, as I say, nobody's more than half an hour away from home, so they can go home for a meal. But in those days it was a full day. So with that and 2 buns, unbuttered, well, no, it would be fresh enough. But my goodness, you devoured them because you were hungry.
You really did. I can't help but laugh, Harvey, because I'm remembering the same man on the same occasion, and you would look to see where the Thorkin of smoke was going up, so that you would know where the coffee was. And
yes.
One of the most respected personalities in farming in my time, Fred and Turner Crystal. Yes. They were great men in the agricultural scene, weren't they? And I suppose it was fair to say that there were other auctioneers indeed, but Fred and Turner Crystal would probably conduct the majority of the farm sales.
Oh, yes. And you talk about the big sales, but there were smaller sales too. Because I remember a neighbour of ours, he was William Kermode, who farmed at Beleg, a little 60-acre farm over here. He was a tenant farmer. The day came when he decided to give up farming. The farm was sold, but he didn't want it, the son didn't want it. And it was about this time of the year, Hollantide, and it was a dreadful morning. I'd been helping him. I'd been sorting the sheep and the cattle, and I went over to help. And about 11:15, and the sale was due to start at 11, there was hardly a soul in the place. And I said to Fred Crystal, I feel sorry for Willie Kermode. He's come now to the end of his days. It's the last thing, last sale he'll have, the last money he'll ever have in. And I said, there's very few people look at us, you're going to have a poor sale. And Fred Crystal said to me, don't worry, it only takes 2 men to put a price up. And by 11 o'clock, I suppose there were a couple of 100 people there, and he had a very good sale. But what I was going to say, it was 1961, I remember the year well. And he stayed on the farm for a bit because the chap that bought it didn't want to move in for the time. And he stayed in for a little while. And Willie Kermode one day came over the field. There's a track, it's the next farm to here. So he came over the field and he was waving this thing in his hand, and he said, look at that, he said, £2,000, he said. £2,000, and that was for all his stock and his implements. But it was wonderful in those days. 1961. He said, I'm never going to work again. He said, you're fools, he said. Well, he went into Douglas. He'd been left a house by an aunt, so he had somewhere to live. And he went in, and it was just at the start of inflation. Yes. Because the very next winter, he was up here looking for a job thinning turnips. Right. He said, you can't live. He said, I can't live on what I've got.
Two great countrymen in conversation, Harvey Briggs and John Kennaugh. And making ends meet in hard times is by no means limited to farm workers. John Kennaugh discovered that when talking with Callin Hudson from Dorby about his dad, a very gifted man whose eyesight problems caused him to change his career.
Yes, Dad, he was born in Dalby, spent his young days at school in Dalby. Then he went to Douglas High School, and then after that on to Manchester University and became a chemist, BSc. Then his eyesight started to fail, and he came back to Dalby again and farmed at Callin farm at the top of the Yarble Road.
I remember him because he was the man appointed to issue licenses, dog licenses and cart licenses we used to have in those days, ration books. Do you remember him doing that?
Oh, yes. There was no such thing as dole in those days. Anybody who was out of work was on the parish, they called it. And believe it or not, men used to walk from Higher Foxdale out to Dalby to collect their money off the parish.
Because that was all in the parish of Patrick, wasn't it?
Yes, all in the parish of Patrick. And then after I think I was 5, when we got the Callin Hotel, and we moved up there then.
And you lived in the Callin Hotel?
Yes. No electric, no mains water.
How did you manage?
Oh, they had the well. It was all right until there was a drought, a very dry summer, like we used to get in those days.
Right.
It seemed to be.
So you were taking visitors?
Up to 30.
You're a great man for yarns, Callin, and you've come now to Peel to live, and you did some work in Peel. I know you told me one particular yarn. You were a builder with Johnny Leece. Was it?
No.
Oh, who were you with?
Ernie Gregor.
Oh, Ernie Gregor.
Yes,
right.
Yes.
Tell me about the job you went to do in one of the Peel houses where you were yourself and your mate had to put a chimney pot on a very tall chimney stack.
Oh. We just had to do this house to put a new chimney pot on. It's an old stone-built house, and the chimney flue, the inside, instead of being like now about 9 inches square, was well over a foot square. Stone-built, quite big. And the bottom of the base of this chimney pot would be somewhere about 10, 11 inches, which was not big enough to sit on the stonework. So we had to put slates across the corners, or pieces of metal, I forget now which we used. I think it was slates, so that this could sit on there. And these pots are quite heavy.
They are, and they're much bigger than you ever suspect, aren't they?
Than you think, yes. Now, the fellow I was helping or with was a year older than me, so he was boss.
Right.
And we had a ladder from the street, a 30-foot ladder up to the
30
roof.
feet?
Yeah.
With a chimney pot?
Ladder, yeah. And then another ladder up the roof, and another little ladder from the ridge of the roof up to the stack. Kenny was carrying the pot. See, he was older, so he was in charge. I followed him up and then steadied him while he got on the roof, and he went up the ladder on the roof. And when we got to the ridge, I sat on the ridge to steady the little ladder up to the stack. So Kenny carries this pot up, and now he's trying to land it. And the slates kicked, and the pot went straight down the flue and stuck halfway down.
What did you do then?
We went and got another pot. And as far as I know, that pot is still there, still stuck in the flue. Well, there's no way we could have got that out. Oh, no.
And chimneys are the link between Callin Hudson and another native of Peel, Eddie Leece. Hard times came to the Leece family too, but that just drove Eddie's dad, Tommy, to learn a new skill.
Towards the end of the 1920s, there was a bit of a depression on the island, and people went away and so on. And my father was one of those who didn't have a job, and he was a lively man. He did a lot of woodwork and so on. He didn't like being idle. He was always busy. And he saw in a magazine an advert for sweeping brush and sticks. So he rode off to this place, and back came this bundle, a couple of sweeping brushes, and I don't know, dozen sticks, 20 sticks. So he started out on a sweeping chimney business.
Oh, did he?
Yes,
Yeah.
he started sweeping chimneys. £0.50, I think he charged, but a bottle of Guinness would do him. But he was very good. Old age pensioners, he didn't for nothing and so on. But after he'd been at this for a little while, he made a good name for himself. Even when he started work, he used to tie these old brushes to his bicycle at dinner time, and he'd go off and sweep somebody's chimney at dinner time. He coined the phrase, avoid the police and get Tommy Leece. You see, so when I went to school, of course, that's when I had this shouted after me, avoid the police and get Tommy Leece, in order to get me to chase them. Oh, so some of the people in Peel would remember that. Aye, that was a good one, that.
Yes.
And that's almost all we have time for. But I think the conclusion of John Kennaught's conversation with Harvey Briggs says much about the importance of listening to stories from the past.
It is marvellous to reminisce. Some people criticise us for looking backwards, but really, if we look back, it teaches us who we are and how we became what we are, and history is very, very valuable. And for now, this is John Kennaugh signing off.
And so we close the door on this series of The Archive Room. If you've missed any episodes, you'll find them all as podcasts at manxradio.com or via your usual podcast provider. And there's just one thing left to do, and it's to deal with that mystery voice.
Look after yourselves and goodbye, bye, 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 bye.
Congratulations if you recognised JOHN GRIERSON, one of the founders of Manx Radio and our first station manager. And as we celebrate our 60th anniversary next summer, I'm sure we'll hear a lot more of Mr Grierson from the archives. Back in the present day, this is Judith saying thank you for listening and wishing you a very good evening.